Hey everybody, and welcome back to Everyday English Pod.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of English learners out there really struggle with, and that is this idea of overthinking when you're trying to speak English.
Right.
You've studied the grammar, you've learned a lot of vocabulary.
Yep.
But then when it comes time to actually have a conversation, it's like your brain just freezes up.
It does.
And you end up, just fumbling over your words or just not being able to get your point across.
Exactly.
So we're going to be talking about this idea of overthinking. What are some of the reasons why we do it?
Yeah.
And more importantly, what are some strategies that we can use to overcome it?
I think a big thing too is, like you said, you've learned all this grammar, all this vocabulary, and you feel like you should be able to speak.
Right.
But then when it comes down to it, you can't remember a thing.
You can't.
And it's just like, it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at some tips for kind of getting over that frustration and being able to actually, communicate.
Yeah, and to enjoy the process, right?
Exactly.
Because I think a lot of times we get so caught up
Yeah.
in trying to be perfect
Yeah.
that we forget that the goal is actually to communicate.
Absolutely. And to enjoy it.
And to enjoy.
To have fun.
Right. So one of the first things that we should kind of understand is
Yeah.
how native English speakers actually process language.
Yeah.
Because it's very different
Yeah.
than the way a lot of learners tend to approach it.
Right.
When we're speaking, we're not, thinking about each individual word and trying to translate it,
No.
from our native language to
I
English.
don't have time.
We don't have time.
Especially in a, fast-moving conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about thinking in these chunks or in these phrases,
Right.
these common expressions that we use all the time.
Yeah. Like, what are some examples?
Like, how are you doing?
How are you doing? How's it going?
See you later.
See you later.
What's up?
Exactly. Yeah. What's up?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know.
All of these things that we just kind of say automatically without even thinking.
It just rolls off the tongue, right?
It does. It does.
And that's one of the big things that we want to help our listeners with.
Yeah.
Is to build up that kind of automaticity.
Yeah.
So that they're not having to think so hard
Right.
about what they want to say.
And that's a really important point, right? This idea of automaticity.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more that we can make our speech automatic,
Yeah.
the less we have to think about it and the more fluent we will sound.
Exactly. And, I always tell my students, it's kind of like driving a car.
Oh, yeah.
When you first start learning to drive,
Right.
you're thinking about every single thing.
Everything.
Where's the gas? Where's the brake?
Right.
How do I turn the wheel?
Am I going too fast? Where are my hands even supposed to be?
Right. And so you're so focused on all of those individual actions
Right.
that you can't really pay attention to the road.
Exactly.
And you're probably driving very slowly.
Right.
But as you get more practice,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes automatic.
It does.
You don't have to think about where the brake is.
Right.
You just do it.
You just press it.
You press it.
And you can focus on the conversation. You can focus on the scenery.
Right. Exactly.
You can focus on what other people in the car are saying.
And that's what we want with English.
Exactly.
We want you to be able to focus on the message that you're trying to communicate
Right.
and not on, where's the verb?
Yeah.
Where's the preposition?
Where does this word go in the sentence?
Exactly.
Right. And so these chunks, these phrases,
Yeah.
help us to achieve that automaticity.
Yeah.
Because we're not having to build each sentence,
Yes.
word by word from scratch.
Right. We have these ready-made pieces
Yeah.
that we can just pull out and use.
Right. And the more of these chunks that we have,
Yes.
the more easily we can combine them
Exactly.
to create, longer sentences.
Yeah. Yeah. More interesting sentences.
Right.
And also to understand, when we're listening to native speakers,
Right.
we can understand them better.
Right. Because we're recognizing those chunks.
Yeah.
We're not getting caught up in every single word.
Right.
We're hearing those chunks and we're like, okay, I know what they mean.
Yeah. And a lot of times you'll notice too that native speakers,
Yeah,
they'll respond to you using those same chunks.
they do.
So if you say, how are you doing?
Right.
They might say, I'm doing well. How are you? And
Right.
so it's this like back and forth of these
Right.
prefabricated pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another really important point is to listen to how native speakers actually speak.
Right.
Pay attention to not just the words that they use,
Yeah.
but the way that they structure their sentences,
Yeah. The rhythm.
the rhythm, the intonation,
The intonation, the pauses.
the pauses, all of that.
All those things contribute to natural sounding speech.
Exactly. And you'll notice that native speakers
Mm-hmm.
We tend to speak in these bursts or these chunks.
Yeah.
We don't always speak in these perfectly grammatically correct sentences.
We don't.
And that's okay.
Right.
The goal is to communicate.
Yeah.
And as long as the person that you're talking to understands what you mean,
Right.
that's really all that matters.
Exactly.
And I think that's something that a lot of learners
Yeah.
kind of get caught up on.
They do.
Is this idea of like having to be perfect.
Yes.
And I understand that because, when you're learning a language,
Mm-hmm.
you want to do it right.
You want to get it wrong.
You want to get it right.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that even native speakers make mistakes.
We do all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
And it's not the end of the world.
Right.
And in fact, I think sometimes when we make mistakes,
Yeah.
it can actually be a good thing because it helps us to learn.
It does.
We realize, oh, okay, I made a mistake there. Maybe I should try to do it differently next time.
Right. And it also helps us to not take ourselves so seriously,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of times that fear of making mistakes
Yeah,
is what holds us back from speaking.
it does.
So if we can kind of laugh at ourselves a little bit
Yeah.
and just, be okay with making mistakes,
Yeah.
then I think it frees us up
It does.
to actually communicate.
And you know what I've found in my experience as an English teacher
Mm-hmm.
is that a lot of times native speakers
Yeah.
actually appreciate it when learners make an effort
They do.
to speak English.
They do.
Even if it's not perfect.
Even if it's not perfect.
We can see that you're trying.
Yeah.
And we respect that.
We do.
And we're more than happy to help,
Absolutely.
correct yourself if you need to or to clarify anything.
Yeah, and I think most native speakers are pretty patient.
Yeah.
They'll give you the time
It will.
to express yourself.
So don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Right.
Embrace those mistakes because they're part of the process.
They are.
And the more mistakes you make,
Mhm.
the more you're going to learn.
Exactly.
So just take a deep breath, relax,
Yeah.
and try to enjoy the process.
And remember, the goal is communication,
Exactly.
not perfection.
So now let's talk about some specific strategies that we can use
Okay.
to overcome this overthinking habit
Yes.
when we're speaking English.
All right.
One of the things that I found to be really helpful
Mm-hmm.
is to slow down.
Okay.
I know that might sound a little bit counterintuitive
It does.
because a lot of times when we're nervous, we tend to speak faster.
Yeah. We want to get it over with.
You want to get it over with.
Yeah.
But the problem with speaking too quickly
Mm-hmm.
is that
Yeah.
it can actually lead to more mistakes.
It does.
And it can also make it more difficult for the other person to understand us.
Right, because we're not giving our brains
Yeah.
enough time to process what we're trying to say.
And we're not giving the listener enough time to
Right.
process,
Yeah.
what we're saying either.
Exactly. And so by slowing down,
Yeah,
we're giving ourselves more control,
right.
and we're also helping the listener to understand us better.
And what I've also found is that
Mm-hmm.
when you slow down,
Yeah,
you actually project more confidence.
that's true.
Because when you're speaking too quickly, it can kind of sound like you're not sure what you're saying.
Right, you're nervous.
You're nervous.
You're unsure.
But when you take your time,
Yeah,
it shows that you're in control
right.
of your thoughts
It shows that you're confident
and your words.
in what you have to say.
Right. And so it can actually make you feel more relaxed
Exactly.
and more confident overall.
Yeah. So slowing down doesn't mean that you're not fluent.
Right.
It just means that you're speaking at a pace
Right.
that allows you to think clearly
To think clearly.
and to articulate your thought.
to articulate your thoughts. And one way to practice this
Yes.
is to just be conscious
Mm-hmm.
of pausing
Right.
between your thoughts.
Yeah.
When we're having a conversation like this,
Mm-hmm.
we naturally pause.
We do.
We take a breath,
Mm-hmm.
we gather our thoughts,
Yeah.
and then we continue speaking.
And that's okay.
And that's okay.
Silence is not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing
It is.
because it gives us time to process.
Yeah.
And it also gives the listener time to process.
Right.
So don't be afraid to pause.
Yeah.
Take your time.
Don't rush.
And your speech will actually be more fluent
It will.
as a result.
And another thing that slowing down helps with
Yes.
is pronunciation.
Yes.
If you're rushing through your words,
Right.
it's easy to mumble,
To mumble.
to skip over syllables, to not pronounce things clearly.
Yeah.
But when you slow down,
Mhm.
you have more time to pay attention to how you're forming the sound.
To how you're forming the bounds.
Yeah, and that can really help your listeners understand you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's really important
Mm-hmm.
for English learners to remember,
It is.
is that, we may be thinking in our heads, oh, I'm speaking clearly.
Right.
But to a native speaker, it might not sound that clear,
It might not.
because we're not used to the sounds of English.
Right.
And so it's really important to be conscious
Yeah.
of our pronunciation
Yeah.
and to slow down
Yeah.
and to articulate
And to practice.
and to practice.
Yeah.
Another strategy that I think is really helpful
Yeah.
is to practice in everyday situations.
Right.
Don't wait for a formal English class or a language exchange or something like that.
Don't wait for the perfect opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
Use every opportunity that you have
Exactly.
to speak English.
Yeah. Make English a part of your daily life.
Exactly. Whether you're at the grocery store, ordering a coffee,
Asking for directions.
talking to a cashier.
Yeah.
Just small little interactions like that.
Talking to your neighbor.
Talking to your neighbors if they speak English.
Yeah.
All of those little moments add up.
They do.
And they help you to become more comfortable with speaking the language.
And you know what I found is that
Yeah.
when I encourage my students to do this,
Mm-hmm.
they often come back and they say, oh, I didn't realize how many opportunities I had
Right.
to speak English.
To speak English.
It's all around us.
It is.
Yeah.
And the more that we can just kind of integrate it into our daily lives,
Right.
the less scary it becomes.
Exactly. It becomes more natural.
It becomes more natural.
Yeah.
And another thing that I think can be really helpful is to find a speaking buddy.
Right.
Someone who is also learning English.
Yeah. A friend, a classmate, a colleague, someone who you can practice with.
Someone who you can practice with regularly.
On a regular basis.
And the benefit of this is that, you're both in the same boat.
You are.
So there's less pressure.
Right.
You can make mistakes.
Yeah.
You can laugh about it.
You can help each other.
You can help each other.
Yeah.
And you can just kind of, relax and have fun with it.
And I think it's also really helpful to have someone to hold you accountable.
Yes.
If you have a speaking buddy,
right,
you're more likely to practice because you have that commitment.
That commitment.
To that other person.
To that other person.
Yeah.
And another thing that I found to be really helpful is something called mental rehearsal.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of this?
I have.
Okay, so this is basically the idea of imagining yourself speaking English in a particular situation before you actually have to do it.
So, like, for example, if you know that you're going to have to order food at a restaurant in English, you can mentally rehearse that situation
before you go to the restaurant.
So imagine yourself, walking into the restaurant, going up to the counter or sitting down at a table, looking at the menu, deciding what you want to order, and then actually placing your order.
Yeah, and speaking to the waiter or waitress.
With the server.
In English.
In English.
Yeah.
And what this does is it helps to train your brain to react in English.
Right.
More naturally.
It's like a dress rehearsal.
It is.
For your brain.
For your brain.
Yeah.
And it also helps to reduce anxiety.
Yes. Because you've already done it.
Because you've already done it in your head.
In your head.
And so it's not so scary.
Right. It's not so new.
When you actually have to do it in real life.
It's familiar.
Yeah.
And so when you're doing this mental rehearsal, try to make it as realistic as possible. Visualize the setting.
Visualize the people.
Visualize the people.
Visualize the sounds.
The sounds, the smells.
Make it as real as you can.
As you can in your mind.
And imagine yourself speaking confidently.
Yes.
Fluently.
Without hesitation.
Yeah.
And that will really help you to feel more prepared.
It will.
When you actually have to speak English.
And I think it's also important to visualize yourself succeeding.
Yes.
Imagine the conversation going well.
Right.
Imagine yourself understanding the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine them understanding you.
And imagine them understanding you.
Because I think that positive visualization can really help to boost your confidence.
Yeah.
And to reduce your anxiety.
And so when you're doing this mental rehearsal, really focus on that smooth flow of the conversation.
Yeah.
Imagine yourself speaking without any awkward pauses, without any searching for words.
Without any stumbling.
Without any stumbling or stuttering.
Just a natural flow.
Just a natural flow.
Yeah.
And the more that you can do this, the more natural your English will start to sound.
Exactly.
Now, while mental rehearsal is great,
yes,
it's also important to push yourself to think and speak spontaneously.
Right.
In real time.
In the moment.
In the moment.
Yeah.
You know, because you're not always going to have the opportunity to mentally rehearse.
You're not always going to know
every situation.
What's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you need to be able to think on your feet.
Right. You need to be able to adapt.
To unexpected situations.
And the more that you practice thinking and speaking spontaneously, the better you'll get at it.
It's like any skill.
It is like any skill.
The more you practice,
the better you become.
The better you become. And it really is about, you know, building that muscle memory in your brain for speaking English.
Building those neural pathways that allow you to speak without thinking.
Without thinking consciously about it.
Right.
And one of the best ways to do this is to engage in real conversations.
Right.
You know, don't just practice by yourself.
Yeah.
Don't just read textbooks.
Don't just listen to podcasts.
Don't just listen to podcasts.
Get out there and talk to people.
Get out there and talk to people.
Yeah.
You know, join a conversation group.
Go to a language exchange.
Go to a language exchange.
Talk to your neighbors.
Talk to your friends.
Talk to your colleagues.
You know anyone who speaks English.
Yeah.
And just practice.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
You know, because that's how you learn.
That's how you learn.
And the more that you can just kind of, you know, let go of that fear.
Of that fear of making mistakes.
Yeah. The more fluent you will become.
And I think it's also important to remember that in a real conversation.
Yeah.
You're not just speaking, you're also listening. And active listening can really help. To improve your fluency.
In a couple of ways. How so?
Well, first of all, when you're actively listening, you're not thinking about what you're going to say next.
Right.
You're focused on what the other person is saying.
You focus on understanding what they're saying.
And that can actually help you to respond more quickly. And more spontaneously. Because you're not overthinking your own response.
And you're also picking up on those chunks, those phrases, those patterns of speech.
The rhythm, the intonation.
That native speakers use. And so it's like you're kind of absorbing that.
We're absorbing it.
Subconsciously.
Yeah.
And then when it comes time for you to speak, it's more likely to come out naturally.
Right, because you've heard it.
Because we've heard it.
You've seen it.
You've
been exposed to it. Yeah.
And so I think active listening is a really, really important skill for English learners to develop.
Yeah, and I think it also helps to reduce that feeling of pressure. You know, when you're so focused on what you're going to say next.
Right.
You can get really anxious.
You can.
But when you're actively listening, you're not thinking about yourself.
You're in the moment.
You're in the moment.
You're present. And that can really help to reduce anxiety.
Exactly.
Another strategy that I think is really helpful is to use repetition.
Okay.
You know, we talked about those chunks, those phrases, those patterns of speech. The more that you repeat those, the more natural they will become.
The more automatic they will become?
Yeah. You know, it's like practicing a musical instrument or a sport.
Yeah.
You know, the more you do it,
the better you get.
And
the easier it becomes.
Yeah. And so find those phrases that you use a lot. You know, maybe it's phrases for introducing yourself.
Yeah.
Or for asking questions.
Or for giving your opinion.
Yeah. And just practice saying them over and over again.
Out loud.
In
front of a mirror. Record yourself. Yeah.
Listen back to it.
Yeah.
And just get those phrases really ingrained in your brain.
Ingrained in your muscle memory.
Yeah. So that when you need to use them.
Yeah.
They just come out naturally.
Without thinking.
Right. And the benefit of this is that it not only makes your speech sound more fluent.
Yeah.
But it also prepares you for unexpected situations.
Yes, because you have this toolbox. Of phrases.
That you can pull from. In any situation. Yeah.
So you're not caught off guard.
Right.
You know, you're not like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say.
Right.
You have something to say.
Yeah, you have those tools.
At
your disposal. Yeah.
And another thing that I think can be helpful is to use visualization.
Okay.
So this is similar to mental rehearsal.
Yeah.
But it's more about picturing yourself in specific situations where you might need to use English.
So, for example, if you know that you're going to be traveling to an English-speaking country.
To an English-speaking country.
You can visualize yourself.
Yes.
In different situations.
At the airport. At the airport.
At the hotel.
At the hotel.
At a restaurant.
At a restaurant.
Asking for directions.
Asking for directions.
You know, all of those things that you might need to do.
Right.
And the more that you can visualize yourself in those situations, the more comfortable you will feel.
The more prepared you'll feel.
When you actually have to do them.
And the less likely you are to overthink.
To overthink.
Yeah.
Because you've already done it in your head.
Right. It's familiar.
It's familiar.
Yeah.
And so I think visualization is a really powerful tool that can help us to feel more confident.
Yeah.
And less anxious.
Less stressed.
Less stressed.
About speaking English.
When we have to do it.
Yeah.
And another really important point is immersion.
Immersion.
Surround yourself with English as much as possible.
As much as possible.
You know, listen to English music.
Watch English movies.
Watch English movies and TV shows.
Read English books.
Read English books and articles.
Listen to English podcasts.
Listen to English podcasts.
Talk to English speakers.
Talk to English speakers.
Yeah.
You know, the more that you can expose yourself to